everybody, Casey graduated from Texas State University. Go Bobcats! with a bachelor's in aquatic biology and a master's degree in aquatic resources. He's worked for BioWest, a private consulting firm, since 2013 as an aquatic ecologist and plant ecologist. He's been involved in multiple aquatic-related restoration and ecology projects, with his main focus in aquatic plant ecology. Casey has also spent his personal time studying and collecting aquatic plants around the state, with emphasis in relocating historical populations. And Casey lives in San Marcos, Texas, but we won't hold that against him.
Here, let's put this in your.
All right. Thank you, Andy.
You know, I love this. Okay, that works too. And then this goes over your ear.
Oh, like Steve Jobs, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I'm a tech innovator. Can you hear me okay? Can you all hear me okay on Zoom? Mom, can you hear me okay? All right. So thank you for having me. I'm actually really excited to be here. Happy New Year, everybody. Hopefully you all survive, all your plants survived the winter storm we had. I moved all mine in and then moved them all back out this weekend. So everything's good now. So yeah, first off, I am an aquatic plant ecologist, biologist. I didn't really study botany or plants to begin with. In school, I actually started studying fish because I thought I wanted to be a fish guy, fish biologist, marine biologist. And then as I started looking for jobs, fish biology is actually pretty competitive. But I really liked the aquatic portion of it. And then I realized one day, hey, I like plants. And so smashed them together and you get an aquatic plant biologist. So my main job is, we have a pointer. We have pointers. I was hired to do a restoration project on the Comel. EAHCP had just started in 2013, which is the year I was hired. And I was also hired to map Texas wild rice on the San Marcos. So I switched between those two jobs, probably about 40% of my full-time job. And then, as most plant nerds are, we like to do other things outside of work on our free time, going and looking for plants. And so I really like to go back and study, hunt old population records of aquatic plants. So this is a site in the Davis Mountains that hadn't been botanized since probably the 1950s. We found some aquatic plant populations that Barton Warnock hadn't collected or had collected back in the 40s and 50s. Nothing had been collected since then. Purple bladderwort, super rare in Texas. It's only in 2 counties. And there's only 4 voucher collections of it. It's only really in 2 populations, each in a separate county. And so we went out and actually hunted down those populations again this summer. Found that. Spider lilies, this is just a pretty picture. Those are everywhere. And then, I'm not completely an aquatic plant nerd. I do like to look for some of the rare terrestrial plants. This one is Young's snowbell, which you find out in the Davis Mountains. Those populations were relocated a couple years ago. And then red columbine. It's always a great treat to find red columbine. It's not as common in the hill country nowadays. So moving on. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I actually moved this from the very last slide to pretty early on. I think it's really important for, especially nowadays with drought and floods and all of the climate that we're kind of encountering with growth and everything, to just be a great informed advocate. Comel River, we do not have a Friends of Comel River. We do have a Friends of San Marcos River. Comel River has never really gotten an advocacy group. We have Friends of Landa Park. We have Headwaters. We have a couple of smaller groups that pick up trash and things like that. But no one has really ever focused on the Comal River, Friends of Comal River, preserving Comal River. And so there are things that come out in the news sometimes, and headlines that are kind of partial truths. You know, the newspapers want to put a grabbing headline, but you really need to go back and do some background checks and kind of get to the root of sometimes what these articles are talking about. For instance, right now, the headline I keep on seeing is the Edwards Aquifer is the lowest it's been. Lowest it's been. The rest of that headline should say it's the lowest it's been at the beginning of a new year. We have been lower. Right now, we're sitting at 78 CFS. This summer, we were down in the 60s. Last summer, we were down in the 50s. So those are things we need to understand when we read a headline. Sometimes they're super reactive. We kind of need to do a little bit more background check and kind of read up on the nuances of what people are kind of trying to report. So some great resources, edwardsaquifer.net. He has a great bibliography, lots of good history on Comal and Edwards Aquifer. Edwards Aquifer Authority has a great publication repository, all kinds of biomonitoring reports, old just observations of the river, San Marcos and Comal, research reports, things that have just kind of been collected since even the 60s and 70s, really. Meadow Center is a great resource for water related publications, especially for hill country. And then, not to infer that our waters are poisoned, because they're not, but there's a great documentary I just found on YouTube called Poisoned Waters through Frontline, and it mostly covers Chesapeake Bay and Puget Sound, I think, and kind of how the advocacy started trying to save those two water bodies. It's very relatable to kind of what we're going through right now. So anyway, write those down and maybe you'll have some good reading. So how many of y'all enjoy Landa Park and Landa Lake? Everybody. Yeah, so it's very relatable. I'm starting to see it become a lot more busy, especially the last couple of years. So we want to we want to do some thanks. Edwards Aquifer Authority, funding the HCP. They have done a great job of funding prolonged biomonitoring. We have one of the longest biomonitoring data sets, I think, of any project I've ever known since 2000. So we're going almost into 30 years of data that the Edwards Aquifer has collected on Edwards Aquifer, Comal Springs, San Marcos Springs. City of New Braunfels is the current stakeholder for the restoration project in New Braunfels, the HCP. BioS, we are a contractor for both Edwards Aquifer Authority and New Braunfels. That's my company. And then shout out to Baylor, Dr. Doyle at Baylor. He actually did some of the original restoration, the quiet restoration on the Comal back in the 80s and early 90s, actually 90s. And so when we started this restoration project, I really reached out to him, and he had like old GIS shape files from 90s when I didn't even think they had GIS, but he drug them up, and so he's been a great mentor for me, and helping us kind of model through, make a plan, and model through everything. Okay, so before we get into the nitty gritty, we are all going to learn a little bit about aquatic plants. It's something unfamiliar. Aquatic plants are a group, I think, that people are mostly unfamiliar with. And so as a native plant society, we are generally educated on this plant fits in this ecoregion, these ecoregions can contain these plants. And so we kind of see it that way. And that's how the landscape designs go. We want to do a landscape design. We want to design for our ecoregion. But aquatic plants actually are not particular to any ecoregion. They really are particular on water quality, water quantity, sometimes geology, water chemistry, things like that. So in Whittier Rippons, I can go to Caddo Lake and find a patch of the Whittier Rippons. I can then get in my car, drive to Big Bend, and find the exact same species. That's pretty rare for terrestrial plants. There are a few, you'll get some widespread Cytostroma is one that you can find in these Texas a lot. It traverses the state. But there's really not a whole lot of terrestrial plants that you can see covering those wide ranges. But it does not mean that you'll find the Weegia repens in abundance at any of those locations. In some of those counties, you may only find it in one water body, especially in West Texas. It may only be in a certain spring or a certain creek. So they are, while they're locally or they're widely abundant or widely widespread, they may be locally rare. So that's something to really kind of understand when you're talking about aquatic plant biology and physiology. Anybody know who that guy is? Yeah, we should all bow down to Lindheimer. And so amazingly, Lindheimer was a prolific collector. He traveled all across the state, had a house right up the river. But believe it or not, I've only found 1 or 2 vouchers that he collected that were actually of aquatic plants, even though he lived on the Comal River. Yeah, so I guess back then they didn't have snorkel gear or wading boots. I really do think. I think that they did not venture into the water. They, if you read a lot of the older literature, they call them aquatic weeds or aquatic grasses. Especially on the early stuff in San Marcos, the lush aquatic vegetation. But they never really go into detail on the specific species. Wild rice wasn't even wasn't even given a specific epithet, Zania texana, until the 30s. It was thought to be a wider variety of just common wild rice. So yeah, so in other words, aquatic plants are a group that are historically understudied, underbotanized, where a lot of the research goes into how to kill aquatic plants or invasive aquatic plants, hydrilla and water hyacinth and those things. But if you look at about our native species, there's really not a whole lot of research, and that was one big thing with the Edwards Aquifer Habitat Conservation Plan we struggled with. There was no literature to really start and rely on. And again, like I said, a lot of the vouchers that they are collected, they're really old, 40s, 50s. So anyway, it's a very interesting group of aquatic plants to be involved. So just like terrestrial plants, aquatic plants are the primary producers in their ecosystem. So just about any aquatic system you have will rely to some degree on aquatic plants, unless you're talking about really deep water, the middle of the Great Lakes. Although that does kind of have a phytoplankton reliance. So anyway, they're extremely important for ecology. A lot of critters rely on them, maybe not for their entire life cycle, but certain critical points in their life cycle, especially nursery young, eggs, larvae, things like that. And so yeah, so this is later on when we get back to we get into the Landa restoration, Comal restoration, kind of remember that picture and refer back to it. And so the other thing with aquatic plants is they have multiple growth forms. So they are not all one type. You will have, this is kind of I wish I had labeled these actually, but you have your riparian plants, very tippy tip edge of the water sometimes. I don't even really call riparian plants aquatic. They don't need water to complete their lives. But you do have your emergent plants. Those will probably require water at some point in their life cycle to reproduce. But they're still terrestrial on the upper half. They bloom out of the water. They require, usually they require the same types of pollinators as terrestrial plants, bees, beetles, wind, things like that. The water lilies are your rooted aquatic plants, but all their foliage is up at the surface of the water. So they have different adaptations. Water lilies still rely on a beetle or a fly or a bee for pollination. But they still undergo a lot of aquatic physiology in their root structure. Free floating aquatic plants, kind of like your butterworts, are not rooted. They just kind of float around in the water. They will kind of try and get their flower up above the water surface so they can get pollinated. But they're more aquatic in that regard. All their foliage is underwater. So they're a lot more sensitive to water quality and water chemistry. And then your submerged aquatic plants. So those are the special ones. Those are the ones that are completely underwater all their life. They cannot survive any desiccation usually. They some of them will flower out of the water and rely on a aerial pollinator, but some of them actually will flower underwater and use the water as their pollinator. So they can be super specialized. So anyway, so aquatic plants is a very variety of different growth forms and different physiology, and that makes them complicated in taxonomy and describing them and studying them. So we don't commonly think about Texas as having a great habitat for aquatic plants. I mean, we're not Florida, but we've got just as good a habitat if you know where to look as Florida does. But we do have a lot of springs, and those are all really good habitats for aquatic plants. We have rivers, oxbow lakes, all are good historical habitat for aquatic plants. Reservoirs, not so much. Reservoirs are kind of the perfect brew for our non-native plants because they're kind of disturbed habitats. But springs, oxbow lakes, rivers, small streams, bogs, East Texas bogs, are all our historical habitat in Texas for aquatic plants. And so, yeah, we've got lots of habitat, but it is disappearing. I mean, we've lost most of our wetlands. A lot of our streams are considered imperiled for water quality or chemistry reasons. We are getting major droughts. We're kind of in this flood/drought back and forth pattern that's kind of getting worse. And then we're just getting development is just getting really prolific and filling in areas and withdrawing water, lots of water quality issues. So even if the native system remains, we're getting some pollution and things that we wouldn't normally have. That's happened definitely along the coast. There's coastal aquatic plants that you can go back to the vouchers and look for. You go back to that spot and there's nothing. There's no aquatic plants at all. The water body may exist, but it's been cut up or the water's been diverted and you've got saltwater intrusion. And so all those plants have just gone by the wayside. So it's kind of disheartening when you're studying aquatic plants. So I'm gonna stop there and give y'all a chance for 1 or 2 questions because we've got a long presentation. So yes.
Keep saying vouchers. What exactly is that?
So a voucher is basically you collect a plant, generally the whole plant if you can get it with a flower, and you press it in between newspaper and you let it dry for a couple of days, and then you'll take that off. You'll glue it to some chemical, voucher herbarium paper, usually cotton based paper. You write your label where you collected the plant, what species you think it is, the date, and then that goes into herbarium. And so if you go to Botanical Research Institute of Texas, which is now Fort Worth Botanical Gardens, they've got 1 million vouchers. They're the ones I send a lot of my vouchers to, and they have vouchers that go back to the 1850s. And so it's a really good resource to go back and look and figure out where plants historically have been collected, what the populations were. Really good resource. Any more questions? Yes.
So is the Edwards Aquifer what feeds the Comal River?
Yes. Yeah. So we'll get into that.
Okay, and that stuff is terribly low right now.
Yes, it is low. I wouldn't say terribly. I mean, it is terribly low. It's been worse. So I don't want to be, I don't want to over exaggerate it. It's bad. And it could be bad. It could be worse.
What if I forget what the name of that hole? It was empty, right?
Right. Yeah. Spring run 1, spring run 2. We'll get into that. Yeah. Okay. So we'll move right along into that. So Comal Springs and River. So Comal River is historically the shortest river in Texas. It's disputable if it's the shortest river in the United States. I think there's some back and forth on that. But it is unique in that in Texas, I think even in North America, that it's entirely within an urban, it's an entirely urban system. Like it's not, there's no part of it really wild anymore. It's completely been urbanized, dammed, altered. Man, I wish I had a I can use this. So Landa Lake, again, we call that a lake. It's actually a reservoir. It's man-made. The springs obviously are somewhat natural, but there's even question on whether those have kind of been altered a little bit, built up around. Landa Lake has a dam right here. This area is what we call the old channel. That's the historical flow path. Comes down this way, down the Guadalupe. This channel here is what we call the new channel, which was dug for the mills. And it empties into the riverbed of Dry Comal Creek, which is this section. And so this whole area historically was not really part of Comal River. Dry Comal Creek actually did have some springs. I guess as early as the 40s, they were collected. Riffle beetles were collected, maybe even earlier, 50s, 60s. So Dry Comal Creek probably was not dry. It probably was perennial spring fed and was a tributary into Comal River. So yeah, so this area has been, you have the golf course, you have a dam here, you have Landa Dam, you have a weir here. So completely altered. It's not really any part of it is as it was 200 years ago. Tubing, thankfully the tubing occurs on the new channel, this section, and the main, what I call the main stem down to the Guad. Thankfully, no recreation occurs in any of this section, which is great for our cause for restoration. It is the largest. If you look at the historical volume, which is 300 CFS on average. Right now, we're at 78 CFS, 300 CFS, 78 CFS. But if it's an average flow, it's the largest spring system in the Southwest. So quite a difference from what it is now. So it is an artesian spring system issuing from the Edwards Aquifer. Edwards Aquifer goes from Austin up here, pretty much all the way to Bracketville. You've got some Edwards Trinity influence here. Trinity is the main aquifer to the north. There's about 10 to 15 major springs along what we call the artesian zone. Starting at Salado, Barton Springs, San Marcos, Waco, Comal, San Antonio, which don't really exist anymore. San Pedro doesn't really exist. Los Morris barely exists right now. And San Felipe is kind of Edwards Trinity, kind of on the edge. So historically, lots of springs, lots of spring systems. You have some minor springs and kind of issuing in this green area occasionally, and when you go up into the Balcones canyonlands. And as humans do, we follow the water, and so pretty much all the major cities in this region were settled along that line around the springs. So the interesting thing about the Edwards Aquifer is that it is actually highly biodiverse. There's critters that actually live inside the aquifer, which is pretty rare in North America. There's only a few other aquifers that are what we call karstics. That's limestone limestone aquifer, rainwater over the millennia has dissolved out cavities in the limestone. So now you have pockets of water in the limestone, and you have critters that live in those pockets. And so we have vine things like the Pix cave amphipod, what we call the troglodytes, troglodytes are people, troglodytes are the critters. I know I was like, well, people live in caves, but apparently they did, and they were called troglodytes. But troglodytes are the critters. So we have Pix cave amphipod, we have the Texas blind salamander. What else? Blind. Here's other critters that we have. A couple blind tetra, blind catfish that aren't on this. And some of those are listed, some of them are not. And then we have the spring obligate species. So these are the critters that rely on the spring itself. They live in that narrow band where the spring is coming out of the aquifer. Comal Springs riffle beetle, fountain darter, the salamander, San Marcos, and Comal, Texas wild rice, Comal Springs dryalpid beetle, diving beetle, Gambusia is now extinct. And so highly diverse system. You won't really find this in any other aquifer, like I said, in really North America. I don't even know if the world. And it is regulated. It's one of the few aquifers that actually has a water authority, the EAA, regulating it to some degree. And so, yeah, it's a pretty unique system, pretty interesting one to study. So what we're going to be concerned about today is the fountain darter, Ichthyostoma ponticola. Here's a little guy. So they super important, federally endangered. Had lawsuits trying to protect it in the 90s that created the EAA. But you'll never see it. You'll never see it unless you're actually doing what we do in the water, scuba diving or snorkeling. Or maybe one day we'll do a tour and we'll dip some up. And you'll never see them because they stay on the bottom. They have little pectoral fins that they use kind of to perch themselves up. They are a perch, they're a true perch. So what we call a perch, normally in Texas, those are really sunfish. They're related to black bass. These are actually true perch. And perch family. The fountain darter. Yeah. And so we call it a spring obligate because it kind of stays in that thermally stable area temperature. So in the spring, when the springs come or the water comes out of the spring, it's usually about 72 to 73 degrees. And yeah, just there. And so it has to stay, its entire life cycle depends on that thermal stability. If the water gets too hot further downstream, they don't reproduce. If it gets too cold, they don't reproduce. We generally don't have an issue with them getting too cold. We generally have an issue with the water getting too warm. So they have narrow tolerances. And so they are uber reliant on spring flow and the habitat that the springs provide. Yes.
Is that related to the snail darter?
They are. So it's a darter. Yeah. So there are lots of darters. Sand darter. In Florida, there are lots of darters.
All right.
Yeah. So
the snail darters are really endangered.
Yes. Yeah. And these are. I don't know if snow darters are more localized. So fountain darter only exists in San Marcos and Comal. Sand darter is another endangered darter in Florida. There's a couple other threatened or endangered darters in the southeast. So it's a super diverse group. There's one thing I was going to say that is kind of escaping my brain. Yeah, so adults are only about a quarter to half an inch long. They only live about 2 to 3 years, but they can have multiple clutches of babies in 1 year. So you can have multiple generations popping up. So they are pretty fecund. Interesting thing about them, maybe I can talk about it next slide. So interesting thing about the fountain darters on the Comal is when Comal River stopped flowing-ish in the 50s, the assumption is that the fountain darter population went extinct and then they were restocked from San Marcos individuals after the springs. So the Comal Springs population is thought to be introduced back. But now we're kind of thinking that maybe not all the darters died in the system. And so there might have been some genetic hangover. And so I think there's kind of gonna be some genetics work going on in the future to kind of determine that, which would be a good thing. Okay, conservation plan. So this is a great thing. This started off in 2013 with a lot of work beforehand. And basically what the conservation plan does is it helps mitigate mostly groundwater pumping for Edwards Aquifer because you know, they do have some take, but we're actually also trying to mitigate for the fact that these species are naturally rare. They either occur in Comal or San Marcos, or maybe both, depending on the species. So naturally rare, you know, lots of recreation going on that disturbs the habitat. And we've got this drought flood cycle that continues to be getting worse. I actually think that flooding is probably going to be really the bigger factor in damage than droughts. Now that I've gone through 2 major droughts and seen the systems, you know, they say when you're not in drought, you're preparing for a drought, and when you're in a drought, you're preparing for a flood. So we should be preparing for the flood that's coming inevitably here, hopefully, well, not hopefully, but in a year or 2, we should be preparing. But in my experience, the droughts aren't so bad because they occur, yeah, they may get low, but they occur over a long period of time. We kind of gradually ease into it. The system can kind of adapt and the rivers change. I mean, droughts are not something that just suddenly happen. These systems have been going through drought for thousands of years. But our floods have just been horrendous. We get 10 inches of rain, it falls on an urban environment, and you get a wall of water. And it's just a bulldozer, washes down the stream system and just scours everything, rips everything off. So I'm really more concerned, I think, in the long term about our flooding issue than I am about droughts. Droughts can kind of be mitigated and prepared for. Flooding can happen within a matter of hours, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so we do have a biological monitoring program that goes kind of parallel to our restoration process, and this is my company has been doing their biological monitoring program since 2000. So this is the long-term data set I was talking about, 30 years, almost 30 years. Super rare. I mean, you don't see that much, you don't see that long-term commitment to data collection usually on systems like this. So there you go. That's Landa Lake in 1956. This is looking from kind of Landa House up Landa Lake. This is the water that remains. I'm not sure if this is all dry. I think this is dry, but it could also be kind of matted vegetation. And so that was 1956. That was the peak of the drought. The drought of record, we call it. That's as low as it ever got.
How many years had it been?
So 56, 1947 and 1957.
Okay.
That's when the drought. We're 2021-ish, probably 2022, depending on what record you're looking at. Is our current drought. 1947, 1957, that drought, the J17 well, which is the record well, got down to 613 feet above sea level. August 16th, 1956, that's the lowest recorded level. At that time, San Antonio population was 562,000. Okay, so here we are in this horrible drought that everybody says, oh, it's so bad. The J17 well, August 22nd, got down to 625. San Antonio population is 2,525,000. So what's going on here, right? Conservation, maybe, you know, some good regulations. That's absolutely what's happened. And so this is what I'm talking about when you hear the headlines, oh, the drought's so bad, it's the worst it's ever been. It's not. We can get a lot worse. But we need to kick the conservation and some of the urban planning into high gear. So, because it's coming. Okay, so project sites for the fountain darter. We have Upper Spring Run Reach, which is this is in Gail's neighborhood. She had never heard of it called Upper Spring Run. Right. So the green outline is our what we call the restoration reach. Those kicked off in 2013 where we did work. The red outline is our biomonitoring reach. So the red outline has 30 years of data. Fountain darter collection, vegetation mapping, things like that. Water quality sampling. Then we get into Landa Lake. Again, the green areas are our restoration reaches where we've done the restoration work. Red area is the biomonitoring reach where we've done a collection. Mind you, we still do restoration in the red.
Is this all just the Comal River?
Yes, this is just Comel. The old channel, as I discussed earlier, the historical channel, a lot more restoration work going on it. Biomonitoring reach. And so the old channel is actually now, I'll get into a little bit more later, but now it's actually the water flow is actually controlled. So it's proportional. So we're getting a steady flow of water as the spring discharge drops. The old channel gets more water, more higher proportion of the flow. And so that's what we call the refugia reach. If all of this, rest of this goes to crap, the old channel, and maybe parts of Landa Lake will stay solid fountain darter habitat. And we'll have something to start back.
Where on there is Headwaters?
Headwaters is yeah, Headwaters is up here. This is Bleeders Creek. Bleeders Creek comes in here. This is all Landa. Yeah. This is the golf course. Yeah. Snake Island is this little thing right there. Right here. That little gray splotch. 1,500 square feet. Yeah.
And that's the chute right there where it gets narrow.
Yes, so this is the tube chute. This is Stinky Falls. Yeah, and this is what I call the main stem. This Schlitterbahn is from here to here. Yeah, so you can kind of see this area gets lots of recreation. We tried to do some restoration work down there, but it wasn't worth restoration. It wasn't worth spending EAA money to do that with having iffy results. So we kind of gave up on that. And now the water, well, not now. In the summertime, the water pretty much stopped flowing over the falls, and that was kind of a stagnant backwater. So it was horrible habitat. Even if we had restored the habitat, no water flow, it wouldn't have been good darter habitat. So we had to take all that into consideration. So it's just some interesting monitoring highlights just to give you a timeline of this. So 1996, Edwards Aquifer Authority was created. Biological monitoring program began in 2000. We have record of the non-native plant, which I'll talk about a little bit later, coming into the system about 2002, probably an aquarium release. Habitat restoration begins in 2013. Comel River reaches 60 CFS, second lowest on record 2014. It's actually gone below 60 this drought. I think last year it got down to 56. And then we pretty much, in the restoration reach, by 2018, we pretty much extirpated all of the non-native plant. We hadn't restored everything back yet, but all the non-native was gone. There's still a lot of non-native stuff downstream, obviously, and there will continue to be. But in the area we're worried about, we pretty much wrapped up non-native removal in 2018. I do, yes. We'll get into the aquatic plants here soon. So just to kind of speed things up here, how do we collect all the data? So to get a good idea of what the fountain darter does, we do drop nets and dip nets. And to understand what the vegetation is doing, I go out in a kayak and map everything. And so this all kind of gets done consecutively, all at the same time. We're going through a monitoring phase right now. We do have triggers, so generally all that occurs twice a year in the spring and fall. If we have drought or flood, we have certain triggers that when the river discharge hits a certain trigger, we'll go out and do a sampling period. And that just helps us kind of size up what the fountain darter is doing and what the aquatic plants are doing and how the habitat is responding. So we have 30 years of that data. And so we are very fortunate that when it came to designing the restoration plan and determining what plants to use and how to plant them and where to plant them and how to put all that together through this 15-year restoration process, we had a good baseline set of data to help us determine that. That's super rare for a restoration project. A lot of restoration projects, you'll read white papers or literature, and they're like, oh, well, we just assumed this. We assumed that. And then you get a couple years down the road from the restoration project, and it's not doing what they assumed. And so thankfully, we were able to avoid all that because we had this wealth of information. So just like, some terrestrial creatures like the monarch butterfly, the fountain darter is closely aligned with certain vegetation, certain aquatic plants. This is a graph we made in 2012, I think, of kind of a summation of our aquatic plant sampling, fountain darter sampling. And what you see is the number of darters on this axis, the plant species on this axis. So, for instance, bryophyte, which are non-rooted aquatic plants, they got 25 darters per square meter. Algae had about 20 darters per square meter. Ludwigia had almost 15 darters per square meter, on and on and on. Hygrophila, which is our non-native, only had about 6 darters per square meter. And so that gave us a good start right there. Okay. We want to make great habitat for darters. Those are the plants we want to plant. We want to try to incorporate bryophytes, Ludwigia, Kabamba. And not only is it the structure of the plant, but the structure of the plant also drives, it's not really driving the darter per se, it's really driving the invertebrates, and then darter is attracted to the invertebrates. So, so bryophyte, which we'll see a picture of shortly, lots of invertebrates. You go into Comau, pick up a clump of bryophyte, and it's just covered in lots of little copepods and things. And we always find darters and bryophyte, pretty much. So that was our plan right there. The other cool thing is that somebody actually went out and mapped all the vegetation in those study reaches for 30 years. So I can look back at old maps and I know what grew there. Like, imagine going back to doing a landscape plan and going back 30 years and figuring out what grew there, 50, 30 years ago. So that was a super, super important data set. And it also, amazingly, what we also collected was we actually collected the actual invasion of the non-native. So we know exactly when the non-native came into the system. Came in about 2002, like I said. And the old channel in 2002, winter of 2002, was mostly native aquatic vegetation. There was a flood about 2002, 2003. The Hygrophila came into the system, had 10 years to take off, It started probably clumpy, and then after flood, it got dispersed. So by 2012, the system, that section went from completely non-native or completely native vegetation to completely non-native hygrophily.
And how does it get introduced to the?
It's an aquarium plant. So I'm sure someone dumped their aquarium. Yeah.
Wow.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that. 2013, when we started HCP, this restoration reach was covered in hygrophila, about 90% covered. And then now 2019, we've gone in, removed all the hygrophila, and we planted back the native plants. So just this amazing timeline that you can easily look back and see. There's just a better idea of the old channel. Bunch of native stuff, completely monoculture. You know what we say about monocultures, right? You have a monoculture of Bermuda grass or King Ranch bluestone. They're not ecologically, functional. Same with monoculture of aquatic plants. They're just a better view of the plants we decided to choose. Sagittaria is not that great fountain daughter habitat, but we did have the literature kind of suggested that the fountain daughters laid eggs on the Sagittaria. We kind of have not really used Sagittaria lately. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Obama, the Wigia, and Broadfights, those are the three big ones. Yes.
Comment on saying they can't hear and it would be bought.
Okay. Yeah. Well, they just may not hear me.
Fine. Is that what we see when we go walking and there's Landa Lake and then there's large kind of looking
Yeah.
mat?
It can be algae or it can be broadfight. Yeah, it can be both. It just depends on the structure. But it'll look kind of similar.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Is hygrophila another name for Egeria or
No.
hydrilla?
No, we'll get to that slide here. Those are two completely different forms of plants. Yeah. So understanding the plant physiology on the fountain darter, you have to understand that not all aquatic plants are created equal. They all have different forms and architecture, and that can determine whether there's invertebrates on them or not. Invertebrates mean darters come and eat the invertebrates. So if there's not invertebrates, then it's less likely that the darter's probably using the plant. The darter can still use the plant for habitat or for hiding or structure, but it's not really relying on the plant for its life cycle and feeding. Plant architecture is important. So whether it's rhizomatous, stemmed plant, leafy, simple, that's all pretty important. Tolerance to desiccation is important. So one of the things we considered, one of the first research projects we did was to actually look and see what the plants, if we dried out the plants, would they survive? So if the springs went dry, which species of aquatic plant would hang around long enough that when the springs came back up, they would grow and produce fountain darter habitat again. And so we actually figured out some data on that. It's pretty interesting. And plant competition is important. So if the plant is, you're planting 3 plants, native plants, and one of them takes over the other 2, then you're back to your monoculture again. And so we wanted to try and avoid that. Okay, so now to the plants. So invasive Hygrophila polysperma, it was introduced probably into the US probably the 80s. The aquarium trade comes from Sri Lanka. So not at all, not even in this hemisphere. Found it in Florida. You can see Florida is covered in it. Made its way to Texas probably early 90s, maybe late 80s. San Marcos and Comal were the first systems that it was found in. It's a pretty interesting, it's a little bit of a booger of a plant. It can take lots of different forms. It can grow it can grow emergent, it kind of looks an emergent form. It kind of looks like horse fur, and it'll just kind of be green. submerged form, it will look like a couple other native aquatic plants. And so we actually don't really know when it came into the system. Because it probably was misidentified for a couple years before someone actually finally properly identified it. So yeah, it could have floated around a couple years before somebody figured out what it was. Even now, we still have problems sometimes identifying it. There are specific traits you have to look at. But yeah, it is definitely an interesting aquatic interloper. It is a federally noxious weed, by the way.
It floats on top of the water.
It is rooted. So it roots in the sediment, and it likes to what we call top out. So it produces lots of canopy growth, like hydrilla, different leaf form than hydrilla. But when we hit Old Channel, I mean, it was bank to bank and topped out in 6 foot of water sometimes. So it was a massive aquatic plant.
So is there anything native that looks like it?
Yes, I'll show you the next plant. Looks pretty similar.
That's what the canvas on the bottom of the channels was for, to,
Yes, we'll get there. Yeah. And so that's Hygrophila, that's the one we want to get rid of. So we want to replace it with Kabamba. Kabamba is an interesting aquatic plant. It's actually more native to the southeast, but you do have where it pops up in the hill country in a couple of springs, and it's also out in Valverde, which is pretty interesting. It's a stemmed plant with kind of feathery foliage, alternating fan-like leaves. It grows completely submerged, so it's rooted. All the foliage grows up in the water column. It's formerly in the water lily family. How am I doing on time? I need to hurry it up. Ludwigia is our native plant that looks really similar to Hygrophila. Pretty widespread in Texas. Sagittaria is the one I said we thought the fountain darter laid eggs on, but Balasneria. So Balasneria is the one, if you go to Landa Lake, you'll see the real stringy stuff, really long stringy plant. We don't really do much with it. We just kind of let it do its own and not take over. Bryophytes. So bryophytes are non-vascular plants, kind of free floating, and this is the one that the fountain darter really likes. Okay, and the other ones that we kind of use, but we don't really have data that shows the fountain darter uses it, the American water willow, bacopa, and pondweed. And other ones that we know fountain darters don't use at all, spider dock and cutgrass. So we just let those do their own thing. We don't propagate them in any way. Restoration methods, invasive removal, native plantings, maintenance and gardening, Hygrophila removal. I'm gonna speed through these really quick so we can get to the riparian stuff. That's us removing some of the non-native stuff. How do we grow native plants? We decided to grow them in the system. So we made these custom-made trays, fill those with mud, sprig the native plants we want, set them out in Landa Lake, and you grow your crop of native stuff. Take those out and plant them with the boat. Plant them in gravel. There's an underwater with our lovely little snake. And then we have to maintain. So that's what somebody asked, that's what the tarps are for. The tarps we're basically using the tarps to prevent sunlight from reaching plants where the plants that we don't want. We put those over, let them decompose. It's a lot easier than us hand pulling. It's actually better for the system. Y'all may think it looks gross, but they're actually super useful, super efficient. They've saved us a lot of labor, and they're actually 100% effective. Hand pulling, we may be 90% or 95% effective, and we have to do it. Do what? Depends on the species. Usually about 2 to 3 months. Yeah. Gardening, we do a lot of gardening. So we go out there and trim the plants. We resprig sometimes if the original plot doesn't take. Move vegetation out of the way so the plants can get lots of water flow. There's an aerial view. You can see where we've gardened. We've gone in and kind of maintained the area around to keep competition at bay. There's the gazebo. So back to the old channel. I'm gonna zoom through this. There's some data here, but so again, the old channel is a refugia reach. So we definitely wanted to focus on that one. It's great. It's a great data reach because it's the only section of the Comal that went from 100% native to 100% non-native back to 100% native. So we could track what the fountain darter was actually doing in that reach. And what we found out was, so here's the vegetation. 2003, we started seeing Hygrophila pop up. Hygrophila became dominant, so Hygrophila is the dark green. Hygrophila became dominant from 2004 to 2018. 2019, we completed our removal process, and then we started getting the native population vegetation back. So there's that data set. So what does the darter do in that reach? Well, 2001 to 2004, we were getting lots of good-sized darters. So the line is actually the line is darter density. So we're getting lots of darters in the reach. Once we got the non-native invasive plant dominated, you can see our darter density went down. And then once we got back to the native vegetation, the darter density started going back up. Babies. So between 2004 to about 2011, baby darters were not as common in the reach. Probably didn't have a food source. Hygrophila didn't really promote the food source. Not really many babies. And then once we started getting to the native vegetation back, we started seeing a lot more babies. So this kind of leads back to the nursery plant hypothesis. There are certain plants that the darters are relying on for their larval phase. The adults probably aren't as reliant. They will use any vegetation. But those are the plants we want to really promote. So bryophyte, it goes back to bryophyte, Cobamba, Ludwigia. You can see Hygrophila. Babies didn't really even use it. And this changes. This is just a 1 year's worth of data, and it'll kind of swing back and forth. Okay, so that's enough data. Fish data. Back to old channel. Every color is a different aquatic plant. So this section, when we started, was all brown because of Hygrophila. Now we've got red and different colors of green. You can go to this spot and collect darters pretty much any time of the year. Okay. Stream bank stabilization. I'm just gonna run through this kind of really quick. Just kind of pictures. However, any of y'all remember the little island down by the golf course? There's a little island. So it's covered in arundo. We removed the arundo, so you can actually see the island. This was the first thing that happened for the HCP. The newspapers came out and documented all this. It was a big deal. We removed the island. You can see the footprint of the island. We planted back the plants, Ludwigia in this case. And that's the island a couple years later. Nice habitat back, no island, no arundo. So it's a nice.
So that island formed artificially?
Yeah, so that island, and this project kind of completed the process. That island kind of collapsed off of this bank and landed in the river and diverted the river. And so because of that, we decided, or EAA decided they wanted to stabilize that bank to keep that from happening. So contractor went in, we kind of diverted the river, stabilized the bank. It looks horrible right there, but you'll see. So now when you go down there, you'll see the concrete wall that wasn't always there by the pro shop. And then my crew, Israel, us, we went back and planted a bunch of riparian plants. And that's what it looks, that was actually like 2019, 2020. So yeah, so that was the story of that. So now getting to the riparian side. Another critter, another set of critters. So riparian, spring, so the spring runs, spring run 2 and spring run 3. Spring run 3 actually is the larger of the spring runs, produces the most volume of flow. It's also the one that has a higher percentage or higher density of the Comal Springs ripple beetle. The problem with spring run 3 is if you've ever been to Landa Park, gazebo's here, we get lots of water flowing down that hill. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. But spring run 3, we have the Comal ripple beetle. You can also find the Pix cave amphipod. You can also find the Comal Spring salamander. This is riffle beetle, great riffle beetle habitat, woody roots with lots of algae and vegetation on the roots. And then great habitat for the salamander is kind of this open rocky substrate that actually has Hildenbrandia algae, which is only found in Comal Springs and some spring in the Bahamas. Only place in the world. So there's actually a cool little paper on that. So the algae should probably be endangered. I don't know. But back to the water flow path on spring run 3. It's been problematic for a really long time. If y'all have lived here for any length of time. Anytime it rains, water comes off that road. What was that Landa Drive? Comes down that hill, just gushes down. We could never really get a whole lot of stuff to grow there. What silt did build up there would end up in spring run 3. And then on the double whammy was Landa Park Circle was pretty flat, and we'd get water coming off Landa Park Circle and running into spring run 3. Okay, we better get out here.
Closing at 30.
Okay.
You need to get a library card. Please come to the help desk at this time. Thank you.
Okay, we'll make it, I promise. Spring run 3, that's what it's supposed to look like. Full right now, it looks about that wide. And the problem with it again was the water flow path. But we were getting lots of erosion along the old wall. Lots of compaction from the trail, which really was kind of a trail, but not really a trail. And then when people would walk down the trail, we were getting kind of these sinkholes. So it was becoming kind of dangerous. It was horrible habitat for the species we wanted to conserve. And so, yeah, EAA and the city decided we should do something about it. So really the goals were to kind of stabilize the area, prevent silt from running into spring run 3, stabilize it, create a living buffer, and improve overall safety. So we had a landscape architect kind of come up with a design. For the most part, their plant list was okay, but they included a bunch of stuff that definitely would not have grown in this area. So thankfully, we were able to kind of customize that a little bit. And really my goal was to include anything that was growing in that area we could find within a 15 or 20 mile radius of here. So completely locally native, as much as we could do. So we had to bring out the big guns. There was lots of rock, had to bring in a digger. And of course, as soon as we started, we got rain and made a big mud hole, but the spring was protected, thankfully. We backfilled it. So that had good soil, lots of compost, soil was loose and aerated. We just had a really good chance of surviving. Planted it, definitely saw some challenges. Herbivory from the deer was one, people was the other one. So we had to get creative on exactly what we were going to do with that. We came up with kind of this little fence area just to kind of give a better nod to people to stay out. But really, okay, so that area was really getting riparian plants. So riparian plants are not aquatic, but they can, they do stabilize aquatic bank areas. So they don't necessarily need they don't need water for their life cycle, but they can live in kind of wet habitats They have the root structure. So the important thing for riparian plants is that they have the proper root structure to stabilize. Some of the plants that people call riparian, I would not consider riparian. They don't have the proper root structure to stabilize. So that's super important. And you'll get lots of rushes and sedges in that group, trees, shrubs, some grasses, some herbaceous, but mostly rushes and sedges for sure. So one of the good plants that I rely on for riparian habitat is emery sedge, really deep root structure, rhizomatous. It'll spread out within a year, make a nice thick mother colony. It can be can form a monoculture, which in this case we wanted. We wanted it to spread out and really take its roots and really grow into that riparian area and the edge and really form a nice root ball, which it does well. White top sedge is not as aggressive as you would think, but it's a really pretty one. Horsetail rush, which we relied heavily on initially, it actually eventually kind of died out. It was really aggressive to begin with, which I was happy with, and then it just kind of got outcompeted. I guess it did its thing, it did its purpose, which was to get something established, and then other things now have grown in and kind of outcompeted it.
Native?
It is, yeah. All these are native within 10 to 20 miles. Yeah. Elderberry is another great one. So I think this one gets forgotten a lot. Everybody likes buttonbush, but it's a great riparian plant. Especially for the riffle beetles. So the riffle beetles need root structure, right? They need that woody habitat. And so that's what the bushes do, is they grow those woody roots and put them into the water. Bushy blue stem, again, this one did really well for a while, and it just kind of petered out. Canadian germander, I don't think a lot of people use this one nearly enough. Again, it's a rhizomatous plant. I just took a couple of sprigs, poked them in the ground, and it took off. And it's a great butterfly habitat. And blue mistflower. This is not Greg's mistflower. This is blue mistflower. The other Greg's blue mistflower is in the Transpacus. It's not a riparian plant. Biden's Avis, another one I like to use. Great for pollinators in the fall. So it blooms in the fall, right when the monarchs are coming through. And sometimes not really anything else is blooming. So really our idea was to divert, improve the light, and vegetate. So we diverted with these core logs, coconut logs. We weren't trying to stop the water from flowing down, but we wanted to make sure the water was going around the springs and not silting in the area. So we line those and we maintain those consistently. We built sediment traps kind of down by the water's edge to kind of grab any loose leaf litter. And then we tried to kill much of an aqua. And aqua apparently produces the densest shade of any Texas tree. Super shady. And that whole hillside was nothing but an aqua. So we started kind of thinning out the aqua, and we've actually been getting quite a bit of seedling recruitment of other stuff. So that was spring run 3. Spring run 1 and 2 are in process. Spring run 2, so if you're going into the gazebo loop, and you cross the bridge, the spring run 2 goes underneath the bridge. A lot of people don't really know it's there. It was kind of interesting because it had a super steep hillside. It had been incised. So we tried and stabilized that with some coconut fiber and logs and sedges. 5 years on, everything's grown in. You would never know what it looked like 8 years ago. Everything is native. It's a hot spot on iNitrous for butterflies and birds. And so it's actually done really well. We maintain it. At some point, you just kind of have to let it do its thing. So we're kind of at that stage right now. We don't really do much, unless there's just something pops up that we really need to jump in. I mean, say we cut it back in the fall, winter, or I guess early spring. Cut it back, try and keep people out as much as we can, and it's doing its thing, stabilizing the habitat.
Now that on that section you just showed in the picture, now there's a lot of passion vine
Yep.
and Turk's cap. Did they just volunteer?
The Turk's cap we planted, passion vine we planted seed, right? We're gonna try and get rid of the passion vine.
Because it's
Yeah.
taking over.
Yeah, so we're in the, with this spring, we'll probably go out and find the plants. We'll probably pull up most of them, leave one or two.
Good luck.
Yeah. I've tried to cut it back. The caterpillars knock it back occasionally, but then it just resprouts and it just covers over everything, and
Yeah.
we can't just have a monoculture again. So we'll trim it back, we'll find the roots. We're good at that, believe me, we'll be successful. And apparently that's really not, that's actually so there's two, there were, so Passiflora fotida, stinking passion flower, was thought to have two varieties or subspecies, the South Texas one and the North Texas one. Now those have been split completely into two species. So that species is actually the South Texas one, which really isn't really native. They think now South Texas has actually been imported from Mexico or come up. So it's really not even locally native. So, I mean, we'll do what we can. It's great butterfly habitat, so I don't want to get rid of it completely.
And your button bush looks fabulous.
Yeah. Yeah, and we trim those back. They get webworms. Right now they've got webworms, but we trim those back. In the winter, spring, we'll go back and trim the pole, what we call poles. So you just trim the old growth, and then we sprig those other places, and those root out and create more bushes. So those have been really
So
great.
you're not doing more sycamores, they don't have the right root structure?
They do. We don't really want it to be more shady, right? We're trying. I mean, there's some trees now, hackberry and a couple willows and things that popped up, and we're trimming those up to try and get the canopy up. But we're still trying to fight the shade in a lot of places. That's it. Do it. Yeah. So. Landa Park.
Okay.
All right. So if you look, this is Spring Run 3 right here. And you can see all the elephant ears.
Yeah.
If you look through all these old pictures, it's nothing but elephant ears and banana trees. This is 1930s.
Already.
And so we were really successful at killing the elephant ears when we first started. But elephant ears were actually good habitat for the riffle beetle. So we not only did we kill them, then we had to worry about getting something to grow back for the riffle beetle habitat. So it's really important to understand we're doing restoration. Just because it's a plant that doesn't belong doesn't mean that an animal isn't using it. And so the native plants are usually better. Usually there are some exceptions. So we want to promote native stuff, but you do have to consider unintended consequences. And if you don't think it through properly and you are just all about getting rid of the non-native plant, you can kind of do more damage than what you intend to do. And I think that's really the main learning point that we've learned is thankfully we had a good data set that told us what plants to use. Otherwise, we could have planted, other species that the fountain darter could have cared less about. And same for the riffle beetle. So we have to be careful. Okay, so that's the presentation. Do you want to leave? Go for it. So yeah, I hope you all enjoy the Landa Park. We put a lot of effort into it. EAA pays a lot of money. New Braunfels has paid us a lot of money. And we don't take it trivially that, to do the right thing. We put a lot of effort and thought into it. And we want people to enjoy it. As long as you stay out of our restoration area. All right, questions? Yes, ma'am.
What effect the ducks have on any of the plants that you want?
Right, so initially, the waterfowl was horrible. 2013, we had a lot of Egyptian geese. What's the black duck? Muscovy. They were being fed. They would stay in one spot and poop and all that stuff. And we planted some stuff. They would just trample over it because they would eat it or go nest in it or whatever. So thankfully, the city did a really good thing. They started kind of cutting those out. The nutria too. Nutria were horrible. And so for the riparian area, if we still had the ducks and the nutria, it wouldn't be as successful. I don't think it would be even 30% as successful. So yeah, you have to think about those things before you get into the restoration part.
But what effect do they have in the last year since they have sold the Egyptian geese?
In the last year,
Yes, in the last year or two, what do you see?
we see better. We don't see them trampling anything. We don't see them hanging out in any one particular spot because people aren't feeding them now. We don't see them nest much. I think most of the Egyptian geese now are transient. They're coming from somewhere other place. So
Well, my thoughts are, if I can't put my feet in the water, can the ducks just go in and eat up the garden?
Attention patrons.
Like,
Computers in the children's play area are now closed. The library is closing in 15 minutes. If you need help to get a library card, please come to the help desk now.
no, so the waterfowl do not eat darters. The only thing that really is predatory on the darter, crawfish, maybe bass, maybe the larger fish, but they don't really have a whole lot of predators. So
You need
It's-
volunteers?
we probably well, we're kind of done with the plan, all the fun stuff. So not really. When we get to a point where we do, we'll definitely reach out. But we're kind of in a maintenance mode right now. I mean, we're really not doing a whole lot of fancying or anything.
if you have other questions, you could come up and talk to me.
Yeah, so thank you very much.
Thank
That was
you.
all. Bye. Enjoy Landa Lake.
That was awesome.
Good, thank you.
Clean Scott, I'm the one who initially took you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
There you go.
I walk every Friday here in the park, and so I've done that for years.
Yeah, it's a great.
10 years, so I've seen all of it. It is wonderful.
Yeah.
And the bird we see now.
Yeah. Yellow, I mean, there's a yellow one there, I think, a couple weeks ago. That some bird. Yeah, I see. Yeah, it's taking off. Hold on.